It's 9 o'clock, so I'm going to get started. I'm afraid I will run late, so I'm going to start right on time here. Good morning. Glad to see you all. Everyone doing good from the SharePoint, I presume. The crowd seems a little thinner than it was yesterday. I presume that's one of the impacts, but we expected that. I'm going to talk to you this morning about application identity. This concept has been around, obviously, for a while. So my talk is going to cover, the first half will cover SharePoint 2010/Farm Solutions, and then we'll move on to the SharePoint 2013 and the options you have in the app model. Hardware problems, right? There we go. Oops, there we go. All right, so my name is Paul Schaeflein. I'm an independent contractor from the States. This is my third year here. Thanks for having me, and we love it here. The contact information is up on the screen. It's a difficult name to spell, maybe not so much for the Europeans, but I have, if you want contact info, see me afterwards. I can give you a little card, and feel free to shoot me questions with email or on the Twitter, whatever you need to do. I want to make sure you understand this concept before you go out and misuse it. Now, before I talk, here's what we're going to cover, right? We're talking about application identity, but what we're talking about is a security context. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that, how that's made up. We'll go into the different identities that are available through the pages. The two big things that we're talking here are elevation and impersonation. And then, like as I said, lastly, we'll cover the authentication in the app model. So I want to do, before I move on, I'm assuming most of the crowd is developer, but how many people here were here yesterday for Ted Pattison? Right, first one yesterday after his keynote, right? And Ted chastised all of us for using run with elevated privileges, right? He's right, but sometimes you need to do it. And my whole goal here today is to show you when is a good time to do it and how to do it properly so that we don't have any issues, all right? And so this talk, the genesis of this talk was actually the Best Practices Conference in the US a number of years ago when I sat down with Maurice Prather, Maurice is here this week somewhere. Maurice at the time worked at Microsoft, and we got together and talked about what was going on, all the different approaches, and the reasons why we want to do this. So this is what we're saying is the best way to do this in certain scenarios. And of course, identifying those scenarios is the key thing, and I'll cover that in my demo. All right, so an alternate security context, right? The idea here is that we need to do some operation that the current user is not allowed to do, all right? Now, a typical ones that I see is perhaps you have an anonymous website and you want to track some information, maybe taking a survey, or you want to do, perhaps you want to do a vacation request where someone can submit but they can't see others, right? Something along those lines where the current user won't necessarily have the permission to the SharePoint object you need to alter, and so we need to figure out a way to let them do that, right? And that's the shared resource scenario. The other scenario may be that you want to do some processing overnight. A few years back, I worked on a product in which we would let you queue up jobs to run overnight. And the idea there was that we know who you are. We want to operate on your behalf, but not right now because it's bad to slow down the web server. So we wanted to store who you were and then that evening impersonate you and do what you need to do. Obviously, we don't want to pass credentials around, and storing them is problematic. So those are the two main scenarios that I see people want to use an alternate security context. So that's what we're going to talk about. Here are the two different approaches, and these are codes right out of the SDK from back in the 2010 day, right? So if I'm going to elevate privilege, that means I'm going to do something that I can't normally do. If I'm going to impersonate, I'm going to pretend I'm somebody else and do what they're allowed to do. And those are the two, this is the farm solutions. Until I tell you otherwise, I'm talking farm solutions here, okay? Both 2010 and 2013. So those are those two definitions. But before we can do this, when we're talking about elevated privileges, well, where does this elevation come from? In order to understand where this elevation comes from, we need to talk more about the identities. And so when you're in a SharePoint page, if you were to look at the code behind, set of breakpoints, start digging around, you'll see that there are 4 places in which an identity can be set. Right? So the first one is the process identity, and the process identity actually comes from the W3WP process, and it's set at the application pool. So when your administrator configures SharePoint and they create a content web application, they define the application pool settings, and they can set the identity there. Typically, a developer won't be able to pick who that is. Now, on our dev machines, it's always domain admin or farm admin, but in production, we don't know who it is. And the truth is, we don't really care. All right? It's just AppPool identity. So that's the concept we want to understand. Now, when a request comes in through IIS, the W3WP process will create a new thread for that, and it sets up a thread identity. And so this is configured in web.config, and in the SharePoint default, the web config says it's impersonate true. And the net result of this is that the thread identity will match the identity of the user at the other end of the browser. Okay? Assuming you have NT credentials. If you're in forms-based, all bets are off, but typically with forms-based, we'll cover that in a little bit. So the net effect here, and I'll show you, thread identity is the current user. On top of the thread, we have an ASP.NET context. And the ASP.context is also configured in web.config. All right? So in SharePoint 2013, the authentication mode is forms, and there's a special claims auth membership provider. This is the 2013 bit that basically replicates the functionality if you're doing NTLM authentication. So NTLM authentication, the browser authenticates automatically in the thread context. The thread identity is the current user. In 2013, claims mode, this claims membership provider does the same thing. So the thread identity and the HTTP context identity match the user at the end of the browser. Make sense? So audible feedback is good. So I see some head nods. And I'm assuming that means yes, you understand. So if you don't understand, you got to speak up. And lastly, we have the SharePoint identity. The thing at what I'm calling at the bottom, right? And this is exposed to the SPUser off of the current SPWeb. You can't do anything with this. It's a private sealed constructor. You cannot create an SPUser object. It's created for you automatically, and you get it off of the current SPWeb. Right? And typically, this is the thing that we are looking at when we want to work with who is the current user. And under the covers, the authored by or the created by and the modified by columns on a list, for example, come off of the SPUser object. All right? So those are our 4 identities in the stack of identities that we have. And so normally we're dealing with the SharePoint identity, and when we're going to elevate privilege, we'll be moving up the stack to get further into someone who has more capabilities. So as you can imagine, the SharePoint identity is granted permissions inside of SharePoint. Typically, your end users don't have any permissions on the physical machine that's hosting IIS. But as I get up the stack into the thread identity or the process identity, well, that's a different story, right? So the process identity is W3WP, usually an advanced account. That account has access to read the SQL Server. The SharePoint administrator grant them access to read things out of the content database. So that obviously has more rights, more permissions to do things, more risk for bad things to happen. And thus, Ted says, and I agree, we don't want to just run with elevated privilege for no reason, because you're exposing yourself to a risk. Are you aware of all the possible threat vectors on your web server? Typically, developers are like, huh? Right? We didn't configure the firewalls and all that stuff, so you don't know. So why would you expose yourself to that risk if you don't know all the facts, right? So, having said all that, I'm going to switch now to a demo. We're going to show you, I have a web part that I'll go through and it'll show you the cause and effect of all these different identities. So I'm on a machine here. Am I on the right one? I guess I am on the right one. Let me go to my site here. Neither one of those, sorry. And so what I have here is a SharePoint 2013 installation. This works the same in 2010. And what I've done is I've taken, what I will do is let me deploy my solution here. So I want to deploy. Oh, by the way, I just found out from Wes this morning the CKS Dev extensions have gone live. So go to the Visual Studio Gallery, get your CKS Dev, and you can get the quick deploy. I don't have it yet, so I'm going to do the old school deploy. And so this site will provision a web part. And this web part, the idea around this web part is I have a couple of buttons to do the various techniques so we can see the effect of what happens there. So deploy is succeeded. I'll go back here, refresh the page. Pay no attention to the list items just right now. We're just going to talk about the web part. And so here's my identity web part, right? The idea here is I'm showing you the Windows identity, which is NT authority IUSR, which is the anonymous user, right? Because SharePoint 2013 is in forms mode and so on. But under the covers, the SharePoint identity is who I'm logged in as. You can see administrator in the top. So I'm logged in as my administrator on my dev box. And 2013 by default deploys in claims mode, so that's why I get the prefix. So, is that visible in the back of the room? Thank you. So let's talk about what I did to create this. This is just a farm solution I created. It's a web part, a server web part, actually built in 2010 days, brought over to Visual Studio 2012. And all the main ideas here are in this class. And so again, I'm just going to show you real quick. I have a create child controls method that builds up a table to show what I'm doing here, nothing fancy. And the magic happens at the beginning here. Let's go to onload. So when the page loads, I assume I'm in default mode. And when I'm in default mode, then I get the current logged on user. And you can see here, I'm getting it from the SPWeb. That's on line 32. Right? And then line 37, I just call into the Windows, the .NET framework, and say, give me my Windows identity. And that's how I get those two things. And I just set the values. And then on pre-render, I fill the table with the values that I got there, right? Nothing fancy. Windows identity and SharePoint identity. Those are the two that I'm dealing with. If I click the Elevate button, you can see here now my Windows identity has changed. My Windows identity is now a domain user called SP_content. That's the account I use to provision my content web application AppPool. And you can see the SharePoint identity is now this thing called SharePoint/system. I don't have a domain called SharePoint. That's just a well-known user. That's the system account inside of SharePoint. All right? Both of those have permission to do a lot of things, some good, some bad. Just be with it. Now, I'm going to do the impersonate button. And when I click the impersonate button, you can see now my Windows identity is back to where it was. My Windows identity is back to the anonymous user from IIS, but my SharePoint identity remains at SharePoint system. So by impersonating, what I've done is I've impersonated the system account when I run this, and now as you can imagine, a system account can do things that a regular user cannot do. So let me show you how that is performed. So I have two button handlers here. So if I go back to my Elevate button, this is the code that runs when I click the Elevate button. You can see I'm just set my execution mode to be Elevate. And then I have my nefarious run with elevated privileges method here. So a couple things I want to point out about run with elevated privileges. Run with elevated privileges is going to create a new context. Remember I said we were creating an alternate security context to do things? So I'm going to have two contexts running. I have spcontext.current, and I have my new one. And you should never, never pass objects between the two. So what I did then is I'm grabbing my current site ID and web ID, storing them in values, and then creating a new context, as you can see here, line 196, creating a new SP site and passing in that ID. And by passing in that ID, I get a new context. Now, because I'm running this in the delegate for run with elevated privilege, this is where I get that Windows identity. That is my AppPool identity. The code in the middle of this using block from 201 to 205, that's the exact same code I showed you in the onload method. Same 4 lines of code, but the results are different because I have now an elevated context. Impersonate does something similar, a couple extra steps. So what I'm doing here, the key thing here is at line 152, where I'm getting a token, the user token for the system account of the current SP site. SP sites. Remember I said the current users hung off the SPWeb object? To get the system account, I go to the site collection. And so by simply getting this user token, SP user token, now you can see in line 161, this is bad code. I'm sorry, here we go. Line 170, I want to show you the code here. What I'm doing here is creating my new site, but in this case I'm using an overload that takes both the ID and the token. And so the identity of the context inside this using block from 170 down is going to be the identity that that token represents. Okay? So, a couple things to point out here. I got the user token, the system account token from a site collection. That means I can do anything I want in that site collection. Site collection is a security boundary all over in SharePoint, so you should not get a token from this site collection and try to do something in that site collection. It might work, it might not. why would you want to be crossing site collection boundaries anyways, right? So another thing to point out is there's a few scenarios in which the system account token cannot be retrieved. The most common is that in an anonymous page, you cannot get the user system account token using the code I showed you. It will fail. In an anonymous scenario, getting the system user token will fail. And the workaround for that, and that's what my code here is doing here, is if my token is null, then I'm going to run with elevated privilege, get the token, and then stop my elevation, and then use that token to impersonate and do my work here. So this is what we're saying is the best way to use run with elevated. You try to do what you can impersonating. If you can't, you elevate to get the token, and then you stop and you go on your way. So a couple of different, well, I have this in slides. So yeah, let me go back to the slides real quick and cover a couple things. All right. Again, this is just a summary in the slide deck to show you what I talked about. Here's the bad thing I told you don't to do. Again, you can see these slides. I'm rushing through because I have an hour. But here's the part I want to talk about here. So remember, Elevate gets me a new Windows identity. I would want to use Elevate if I'm trying to read something that's typically not a SharePoint resource. Let's say, for example, you have a database, a line of business database off in the corner over here, and you want all your users of SharePoint to read that database. You have two choices. Grant every user in SharePoint permission to that database, or you could go to your administrator and say, hey, this database over here, can you make sure the AppPool identity has permissions on that database? And once he grants one user permission on that database, anybody in SharePoint, you can elevate to the AppPool identity, read the database. That's a perfectly valid scenario. Because I'm elevating because I need to reach something that's not in SharePoint. Typically a database, could be a file system, whatever the case may be. That's a perfectly valid scenario there. Of course, this ensures that your AppPool identity has permissions to where you're going. Right? And this is, you want to ensure you have the new context, as I showed you, by creating a new SP site and do your work inside there to get that new context inside the run with elevated. Okay? Does this make sense? Yes, all right. So, elevation, again, some summary slides I'm going to zoom through because we don't want to spend a lot of time. Oh, I do want to talk about a specific user. Let me go back here one. What I showed you was getting the system account. Right? Sometimes there's a scenario in which you want to impersonate a different user. And so what you can do here, every SPUser object has the token. So in theory, I can do this and say, I want to get this SPUser token for the current user and store it somewhere. All right? It's a byte array. You can store it wherever you want. And then later on, at some future point, you can read that. So I'm showing you here how I'm reading it from wherever I stored it. And once I've used it, I can then use that same overload by passing in a token. In this pseudocode here, that token would be a regular user, not the system account. So I have now, at this point here, everything that runs inside this SP site object is using the context of that user that the token represents. So this is a technique you can use to run jobs on behalf of a user at a later time. Perhaps you have a web page to submit a job and you store it somewhere and you go and retrieve it and do your work here. So that's the scenario around impersonate.
Does the ACL still stand?
The question is, does the ACL still stand?
Yeah, so
The ACL on what?
on the objects that you're manipulating inside.
I'm not doing anything to do with ACLs. I'm not doing anything on objects. All I'm doing is creating a new security context in my code, and my code will run under that context as the user that's represented.
If you try to create an item, that user needs
So he's asking if I try to create an item, the user needs permission to create the item, and that is exactly the next part of the demo. Thank you. I didn't even have to prompt him. All right, so, a couple things I don't want to forget. I forgot this before. So when you talk about this storing tokens and using them later, that kind of runs shivers down the spine of the people in the room next door. They don't like that thing. So here's the rules around those. That token is valid for 24 hours. And at the time I wrote this slide, you used STS-ADM to change it. There might be PowerShell to change it now, I don't know. But just be aware that that token doesn't last forever. All right? And again, this is a farm solution SharePoint thing. It's not OAuth, Windows claims authentication stuff. We'll cover that in a little bit. All right, so I'm going to switch back here to my site. And you can see here, what I'm going to do now is I have a method down here at the bottom that will create a list item. So I have a list, just a generic list that I created, and it has a couple of columns. And you can see here what I'm doing is I have the author, line 222, updates the created by column. And line 223 is a second user column that I added to the list. And the idea here is when I change my identity, I'm going to say that's who created the item, but I'm also going to say who I was originally at the time. So that's the idea around this button add method. So to go to my create child controls, and I have commented out some code here, so let me just put that back. And then I want to go to my elevate method. And right here, after I do this, I'm going to do create list item. And I'm going to pass in the web. And I am in elevate mode. Actually, I have a mode here. It's called mode. It's called what? Elevation mode. It's called. Okay, so execution mode. You would think that I would know this since I wrote the code, but execution mode. All right. And I'm going to take this same code and I'm going to put it in my impersonate method real quick. And let's deploy that. So the idea here is I now have the ability, I want to show you what happens when I create a list item. So I'm going to, its deploy has succeeded. I'm going to go back here and refresh my page. And it's working on it, I assume. There we go. All right. So first thing, before I get too far here, I'm going to go to this identity list, and I'm going to select all items and delete them. Just clean up. You don't need to see my test data. All right? And so I add item, and you can see here down at the bottom here, and I will scroll this up a little bit so you can see it. So what I've done is I've created an item in default mode. It was created a few seconds ago, right, by administrator, so both accounts are the same. All I did was click add. Nothing changed. When I switch to elevate mode and run this, oh no, this is actually planned. So what this says is the security validation is invalid. I should go back, refresh the page, and try the operation again. So I will go back, and I will refresh the page, and try again, and we hit elevate. Hey, that says default mode. That's not what I wanted, so let me click elevate, and it happens again. Okay, so this is expected. And there's this thing that we used to call the canary, right? The canary in a coal mine type of thing. When you get a page from SharePoint in the browser, what SharePoint does is it takes the current user, the current site, date and time, hashes it together, creates some kind of cryptographically protected digest, a form digest, and sends it to the browser. And when the page comes back in, it takes the site, the current user, the date and time, compares it to what came in on the browser on a post, and says, is this the same stuff? And if it's not, that's probably indication of a hack. So why am I getting this now? I'm still logged in as administrator. What is my current identity? Elevated, right? So my identity is no longer administrator. I've changed my identity. So this form digest now doesn't match. SharePoint says, wait a minute, I don't know what's going on here, right? And what I see a lot of new developers, they say, what's going on here? And they hit Bing or Google, and someone discovered there is a method or a property that you can set called allow unsafe updates. So there's a lot of blog posts out there that say, hey, if you have this problem, just set allow unsafe updates to true. Guess what allow unsafe updates does? It allows unsafe updates. So don't do this, and this is the part, that actual act right there, the combination of using more privilege than I need, combined with our unsafe updates, is what gets us developers in trouble. So please don't do that. So let me show you how we do this. There is a method, and I have it commented down at the bottom because I can never remember it. So I'm going to take this, and go back to my elevate. I hit the elevate button, so go back to elevate. And right here, I'm going to paste this in. So in the SP utility class, there's a thing called validate the form digest. So this validate form digest is automatically called in the SharePoint platform when you're doing a post at the time it's ready to change something in a content database. Well, the content database is being changed in my example here. If I scroll down a little bit, the content database is being changed down at line 210. At line 210, I've already changed the security context. It's not good enough. So by simply calling this method here at the top before I change my security context, SharePoint will then validate and say, oh, I know who you are, you're good to go, and things will work. So I'm going to copy that real quick down into my impersonate method, and I'm going to put that here. That must be why all that white space was there, right? Again, I'm doing this before I monkey with my context. All right, we'll build and deploy. Boy, I wish I had quick deploy available. That's okay. Yeah. All right, we'll go back to the browser. And so I'm going to go back. And instead of hitting refresh, I'm going to, working on it. I'm actually going to go to the home page with a GET request. I don't want to keep resubmitting the same form from before. We're going to get the new web part. It won't look any different, but ideally, the behavior will change. So let's hit elevate, and I click, and let's go down to the bottom. You can see here, the bottom one, created an elevate mode, but notice now that, created by his administrator, because my code was taking the original identity and putting it into who created it, but the actual account that did the update was the system account. And if all works well, the impersonate method should do the same thing, and there we go. All right, so this is how you should do it. Impersonate the system account. What I'm doing is updating a SharePoint resource. I don't need to do my AppPool identity to update a SharePoint resource, because the system account has write permission, has full control to everything in its site collection. So if I am its site collection and I'm the system account for a site collection, certainly that's enough permissions to update a list item, right? Create a list item. All right, any questions on that? Before we move on to 2013, which I suspect why most of you are here. After all, we are evolving, right, to 2013. So let's go back to the slides. And here we go. This is what I just told you. You should use that. Okay, identity app. We'll do that in a little bit. I want to talk through this first. So let me give you the background of how this works, and we'll go in and do a 2013 demo. So this is SharePoint 2013 app authentication. AuthN is authentication. So when there's this flowchart that follows. Now this flowchart came from Rob Howard at Microsoft. He presented it at Vegas back at SPC, and I said, that's beautiful, can I please borrow that? Sure, he's happy to pass it on. So we're gonna go through this flowchart. When's the last time we did a flowchart, right? Now these agile methodologies don't do flowcharts anymore, so I had to brush up my skills. So when a request comes into SharePoint, first thing it's looking to say, do we have user credentials provided, right? And so what I've been doing all through here is I'm logged on a page, I have credentials, so yes, credentials are provided. And since credentials are provided, it then checks to see, is this an app web? Okay, let me stop here. I'm making some assumption that you've been exposed to apps before, right? Basic Ted's talk yesterday or Chris O'Brien's in depth on the SharePoint thing. So if some of this is confusing to you, I apologize, but sure, by the end of the next 2 days, you'll learn more about the app model, so that'll make more sense. So we're doing user credentials. Is it provided? If it is this a call to an app web? If it's not, then I have a user-only context and I'm done. Everything I've done so far follows this path. I logged onto my machine. I'm using claims mode with NTLM authentication on my SharePoint farm. I'm navigating to the root web of a site collection that I created. Nothing fancy going on. Right, so this is the path I've followed so far. So I have a user-only context in this regard. And you can see I can change who that user is. What if this is a call to an app web? Well, if it's a call to an app web, then my user credentials have certain permissions. The app has permissions, and so the app has context. So I'm working in a user plus app context. And as Chris mentioned yesterday, the intersection of the permissions between the app and the user are what are in effect. So in this scenario, I could only update the list if the user had permission to update the list and the app had permission to update the list, then it would work. Otherwise, it would fail. Now, the next scenario is, do I have user credentials provided? So if you write a 2013 SharePoint app And then when the app runs, sometimes you might be in a remote website, right? So if I have a cloud-hosted app, the web page is somewhere else, not in SharePoint, and the request is made back into it. So there may or may not, there typically is not user credentials. I don't have a Windows NT authentication scheme going on. So if that, in that case, I don't have user credentials. So I'm looking at the token that's presented with the app. If there is no token with that app, that means it's an anonymous request. And you'll see this a lot in the publishing scenario, right? It's just a request from somewhere. There's no user account. There's no token. It's just anonymous. And we've seen this before. And as you can imagine, we go through here. So we did get a token from the app. And this is a somewhat common request in the app model. The app model comes in. I don't have user's name and password. I haven't logged on to the system. But I do have a token. And that token includes the user value. In depth on the user authentication part of the token, that's Ted Pattison's OAuth talk at the end of the day today. So I'm going to not cover that in depth. So, but if I do have an app token, and that token includes a user account, then I have the same scenario if I came through the other way. So I have a user plus app context, and that's what is enforced. And lastly, I get a token, but the token does not include any user rights, so I have an app-only context. And so the subject here of this talk today, app identity, doing things that perhaps an app needs to do that a user is not allowed to do, app-only context is gravy, right? That's golden. That's what we want. Because if my app is allowed, remember it said it's the intersection of the user rights and the app rights. So if the app has permission to write and there is no user, well then I guess I'm good to go. So this is the secret sauce that we want to do the same scenario in 2013 using the app model. So we're going to switch back to the VM here, and I'm going to go to a different project here. And half hour, awesome. So I have my identity app, and we'll let that open. Identity app. So what I created here, what I've created here is a typical cloud-hosted, in my case, provider-hosted app. And so it's trying to connect to my TFS instance, so we will forget that. So let me open up the solution real quick here. And as you will have seen, or you have seen, when I have a provider-hosted app, I get two projects. One is the SharePoint stuff, and that's the top solution there. And the other one is that remote website. And this remote website is nothing really complicated. I just have a default page, ASPX page, and let me move this over here. And you can see here I have code behind, and the idea here is I'm going to just read the data, bind the data to a list, and show it to you, right? So remember my identity application, I had a web part that's showing the identities. Well, when I'm running now in this other website, as you can imagine, I'm not going to have a SharePoint user identity, right? I'm running as an app. So I didn't implement the same top part of the web part. I'm just showing you the grid of that same items list. And to get that, I'm using the client object model with an error of some sort. Well, we'll fix that. Because of reasons you'll see in a minute, I'm not going to run this code, F5 this code. But you can see here I'm using the SharePoint client object model, the .NET managed client object model, to get my context. As you can see here, I'm just loading up my list. And then once I get my list, I'm going to get all the items. And then during a for each, I'm just creating a new class. So I just have a collection. I should probably scroll up and show you that. Because I'm not running inside of SharePoint, I can't rely on an SP list item collection. So I just have a list. I created a data class, nothing fancy. Kind of like you would see if you had run link. I created a class to store the list items, and then I'm just going to create new ones by reading the list. So nothing too complicated here. And so let me walk through the code real quick. When I have an app, I get a query string that gives me some information that I need to do here, the host URL. And I'm going to then get an access token based on that host web URL, which is using the fun token helper thing. And we'll go into more detail on that in a minute. And then once this line right here gets me the token. Then when I make a request, I pass that token. That's the token I showed you in the flow chart, right? And then once that comes back, you can see here I'm just binding to my grid. So this is ASP.NET code that we've written for a decade. I get a collection of data, I bind it to a grid, I say data bind, I'm good to go. If I'm fancy, I can do paging and sorting and all kinds of fun stuff, right? Are you with me on that? Yes. All right. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So in the SharePoint 2013 app model, right, the default is that we're using a user account, and so what ends up happening is I deploy my app to the app catalog, and then the user installs it in their site collection, and they click on the link that is their app, and SharePoint has this redirect page, and the redirect page says, okay, it's this site, and it's this user, and here's a bunch of junk in the query string, and off to the app. And the app gets the data and says, okay, here's my string of who the user is. I need to get a token, and it does the 3-point dance to OAuth. I'll cover that in depth later today. And then you get a user context, you get an app context, and life goes on. We don't want that. Because if we were to follow the typical OAuth model, our scenario of a user trying to update a list he doesn't have permission to will fail because that token will have the user context. And in our flowchart, if their token has a user context in it, that's what's used. So how do I change that? So Microsoft understands this need, and in fact, they sometimes want to do similar things. Chris Johnson in his talk yesterday mentioned that there is new capabilities in SharePoint where it talks to Exchange, and they surface a folder in Exchange into SharePoint and all kinds of fun things, and there's integration between SharePoint and Link and all kinds of things going on. So Microsoft needed this ability to talk to SharePoint on behalf of a user using special privileges, so they created a server-to-server protocol. So it's S2S is what you'll see a lot of. So SharePoint S2S is the technique we're going to use. And here's the difference. When I started telling you before about this, SharePoint passes in a string that identifies the user, and the application needs to then get a token from the identity store, usually ACS or whatever. It does all this OAuth dance. We're not going to do that. So if we're not going to do that, how does SharePoint know that I have a trusted application? And the answer is a certificate. So what you have to do, this is all in Microsoft's on MSDN, what you need to do is create a certificate for your application. You can create one for every app that your company develops. You can create one for each app that you develop. Your choice doesn't matter. And what I end up doing in Visual Studio is configuring the web.config of my remote web. This is the web.config that's not running in SharePoint. It's this remote web. And you can see here I've actually have a certificate path on my domain. And obviously this you would not do in production, right? But the idea here is I have this GUID that identifies my issuer to that certificate, right? Those things are hooked up. And SharePoint is then told to trust that. And I can see this in the security tab. One place I can see it here. If I go to Manage Trust, you'll see that I have a certificate for my high trust sample certificate. I created a certificate. It's a .pfx file, and I imported that into SharePoint. You have the object here, right? Same thing here. I can import that certificate into SharePoint. So SharePoint is told anything signed with that certificate you should trust. If you've done any work with claims authentication, same process. One thing to note, SharePoint must trust the entire parentage of that certificate. So it has to trust the cert plus its root CA or any other intermediary CAs. I'm not a cert expert. I don't do PKI. I did the next wizard on the domain services or Active Directory certificate services, and it just works. So in development mode, you can do it just using that. Long story short, you need a cert for your app. Or you could decide to do one cert for all of your apps. Your choice, and Microsoft MSDN has guidance on the best way to do that. In addition, I need to then go into a page, app, new, I knew I should have created a shortcut. There's a page, I can't show you off the top of my head, I'm not going to struggle, where you go and you register a new application. And what ends up happening is you create a GUID, you go to this page and you say, here's a GUID. Here is a GUID, and that is going to be my issuer ID. And so I then tell SharePoint in central administration, I want to register this ID with this certificate, and then I create an application context. An application principal. So that's a new concept in 2013. Everything I've shown you before is an SPUser, is an SP principal object. And in 2010, SP principals are either user or Active Directory groups or SharePoint groups. There's a new SP principal of type application principal. So I end up registering with SharePoint a certificate, an ID, and a principal, and that principal can then be granted permissions. The permissions is identical to what you see when you create an app using, we've seen before, where it says, do you trust this app? This app wants to do X, Y, and Z, similar concepts. However, I don't have any granular settings here. The settings are trusted or not trusted, which makes sense. I've done all this work. If I'm trusting that certificate, why would I do this if I didn't trust it, right? So you don't have the fine-grained permissions that you'd expect, but it's a similar process. And I apologize for not having that URL handy, but that's the concept around there. All right, where are we at here? Okay, we're doing good. So I have an app, and in my app, I have a SharePoint, piece of SharePoint stuff, and I have a piece of a web stuff, and you've seen that before. All these other pages here are just fancy code here. So you can see here, here's my identity list item. I showed you that class. Token helper is provided by Visual Studio when you create a new app. It's got a bunch of stuff that does a lot of things, and I'll show you the main thing that we want later. I'm gonna go to my identity app and look at the app manifest, view the code. And so you can see here what I'm doing, right? Typical stuff, the stuff at the top, the properties node, I should equal time over here. The properties node is what we've seen before, except instead of underscore app web URL or underscore or tilde host web URL, I'm showing remote web because I have a cloud hosted app. And then down here you can see that my app principals, any client IDs. So I cheated here, right? I could put in that GUID, that issuer ID from before, I could put that in here to make sure that I have only certain ones coming in here, right, this app. I didn't do that, I'm in dev, this is demo code. And as I would say, best practices is next year. And then you can, now here's the first thing we need to do special. In this app permission request, we need to set this. We're saying that, remember, this is the piece that goes deployed to SharePoint. App manifest goes into SharePoint. And I'm saying anything that comes in with this client ID can give me a token that has app only without a user. By default, they're going to expect the token to have app stuff and user stuff. I'm overriding that default behavior to say, it's okay to give me just an app-only policy. And then here's your app permission requests that we did. Remember I said before, you've got that stuff. So this is web. And if I were to show this in the designer, you're seeing in the web, I probably have full control. So just to show you how that would look, I'm going to go to here and open this in the designer. And that would be here. And so you have a tick box. So I said allow app policy equal true. You can do the tick box, and you see here I'm saying manage the web. But what does this really mean? This scope here, these permissions, here's where this gets different, right? In a SharePoint app, when I set these permissions, what are these permissions for? These permissions are for the host web. So I'm deploying an app in SharePoint 2013. I have a host web, I have an app web. I don't care about my app web at all. And in fact, I have no SharePoint components in my app. It probably won't even create an app web. But I want to have my app to have permission to the parent web. This is a little bit superfluous because I've got the trust certificate going on. But just to be safe, I show you how this is how I would do it if I wasn't using an app-only policy. Now, I'm not going to press F5 because I have provider hosted, and it gets a little bit more complicated. You need to register your app with the certificate to do S2S. You need to then, obviously, you're not going to put an app-only policy in the Microsoft Store. So if I go back to my browser here, and I have an app catalog. So I had to create an app catalog, and then I uploaded my app to the Apps for SharePoint list, and there it is, my Identity 2013 app. It's been there for a little while. But you can see here, so by putting it into the app catalog, it then shows up in my site. Let me go back to the other browser. And so when I go back to my home page, you can see here I do have my app in the recent. If I were to go to site contents, you would see it as well, right? So it's been installed into my app, so I can click that and launch the app. Oops, sorry, I have to click it here to launch it. And now what you can see here, maybe you can't see, so it went to SharePoint into the site, and it's doing that redirect, and it's going to figure out that it should connect to another server. So under the covers here, I have a second VM running that is running just IIS, running an ASP.NET website. And it worked earlier, but it's probably timed out. But because we like to do fun things in the demo, this is the same site on another computer. The difference is I'm not logged in as administrator. So you can see here, I'm not logged in as administrator. I'm logged in as Paul. And what I'm showing you right now is that same home page from before. And notice, I can see the identity web part, but I can't see the list. So this Paul account does not have permission to the list of items. So I've got two accounts here. I've got administrator and I've got Paul. Let's go back and see what we got here. Oh. So notice here I'm connecting to a different server here because I put my web on a different server. Administrator. Admin, did I spell it right? I didn't pay homage to the demo gods today. What I'm trying to show you is this same website. Remember, my remote web is an ASP.NET application using the client object model to connect through. And this is probably what my problem is. So this is how you troubleshoot a problem in app web development. Well, this is an issue. Am I in the right server? My apologies. Lucky for me, I'm not the only one to have trouble this week. Oh, wrong one. So what I'm doing here is I can't understand why I'm not authenticated to my IIS website here. So all I'm doing here is going to IIS on my remote web. I'm not in SharePoint now, just doing the typical stuff here, trying to understand what's going on with authentication on the website. So let's open this up. A couple of the pieces I'll point out there as we wait for this to load up. When I uploaded my app to the app catalog, I provided a URL to the server that's hosting it. Remember in my web app.config, I had tilde remote web URL. So at some point, I need to tell SharePoint what that remote web URL is. And so that was done. It's pointing to this server. And on this server, I have my high trust website. And look at the, open that up here. And authentication is Windows Auth, that's fine. And if I go to ASP.NET, this app here, IIS, and where's the users? Yeah. And that may be my problem. So let me real quick browse this. And if I remember correctly, this is saying deny anonymous user, right? Can I get a little validation on that? What's this telling me right here? Right? Deny anonymous, that's deny anonymous, right? Okay. So how do we fix problems in IIS? Reset, yeah, our favorite tool. It's an IT problem. Yeah. All right, I'm going to go back to SharePoint here. And I'll show you a little bit about my app catalog again. So go to the Office for SharePoint. If I come here and I want to do, that's not what I want, edit this. So here's my app catalog, and you can see I have a name for it, and then further down here is the URL that we're pointing to. So this gets me, and you can notice here that it's pointing to my other site, and my hunch is that that should be HTTPS. So let me go back and to my other site here, and if I go to, I was there before, go back to site contents, and if I look, HTTPS, yeah, you know what, so I've misconfigured that. So I'm going to hit that and cancel, go back, let me copy that shortcut and paste it in. So I'm going to go back here, I'm going to show you what I figured out here. If I look here, you can see that the bindings on this site, view bindings, HTTPS is on port 2013. I didn't go through the whole wildcard certificate to have it and reconfigure IIS to have SSL on multiple points, host headers and SSL combined, so I was using the ID. And when I uploaded my app to the web here, I forgot to do that. So SPWeb.SPUser 2013. If I get to my app here, /hi trust / Identity 2013 app. Let's go there. Go away. Oh, I lost it, didn't I? / Identity 2013 app. No. Nope, either way. So, failed demo. My apologies. All right, let me show you. This is the code. So this is the last of the secret sauce. I'm sorry the demo didn't work. Here's the app-only policy you talked about. So just to recap where I was going with this, right? So we've configured SharePoint to trust a remote web. We gave it the certificate, registered the app. I obviously registered it incorrectly. So I have two servers. I have SharePoint and I have a different server. And they are SharePoint trusts the other server. That code on the other server then needs to call into SharePoint. So it's calling into SharePoint using the client object model, attempting to, and it needs to pass in a token so that SharePoint can then go through that. If you remember back to my flow chart, I don't have credentials. I need to provide a token, but I want the token to have no user. I want it to be app only. And here's the trick. This token helper that is provided to you by SharePoint has this get S2S access token with Windows identity method. And the trick is that the Windows identity that you pass in is null. And when you pass in null as the Windows identity, that token that comes back is for your app with no user. An app with no user is now whatever permissions the app has. What does my app have? Full control on the web, the host web. I granted it permission to the host web, and so I have client object model that will then have a button. I click the add button. Guess what happens? It adds an entry to the list. All right, so before I go on to a little bit summary of all the other pieces of authorization and apps, any questions on this? Okay. So here is how it works typically. And they're showing you this again. This is from MSDN, and we're showing you that you have Office 365, you have an app, you have Azure Active Directory, and you have that three-legged dance that goes on with authentication. This requires a user account. Doesn't meet our scenario. So an option is to do on-premise. You can do S2S, server to server, in which you just have an app and SharePoint. And as it says on the right hand there, it's based on a certificate. And you notice here it's showing you in the cloud I can do this, and on-prem I can do this. So you get this S2S stuff you cannot do on Office 365. It was not possible, right? And there may be some scenarios as you go along, if you're on-prem, you can do a hybrid if you so wish. And this is typically what you'll see when your on-premise IT administrator grants access to the marketplace to get apps off of the marketplace. This is what the hybrid solution could be. You could have full trust apps that we write, doing like as S2S apps. In addition, you could have apps that are going out to the cloud to get the identity, doing the OAuth three-leg dance, right? So these are your possibilities here. This S2S one, I think, is an edge case. So it's only if you really, really need to do something without a user context. Otherwise, you should do your typical app development. And if you do on-prem app development, you don't have to use Azure Active Directory. It can use your in-house Active Directory. There's nothing wrong with that. It just works, right? You create an app, you press F5, and it just works. But when you're doing provider-hosted, you have to do that token helper stuff. And I'm certain that Ted's going to cover more on that piece with the OAuth this afternoon.